Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the warm welcome. And again, I am so excited to be kicking off NGDE 2024. Truly, I feel honored to be a part of this community. And really, my only goal and job of the day is to hopefully make you feel also excited about all the things you're going to learn from all of today and tomorrow's amazing speakers. They're bringing a ton of technical content on all the things that you have to learn. So really, I just want to spend 30 minutes this morning talking about why you should be excited about learning these things, why you should feel good about your decision to come here and learn those things. And in order to do that, I want to take us back a little bit in a time-traveling way and think about where you were in 2010. So 14 years ago, it's scary. What were you doing? Apple had just released the first iPad. Lady Gaga wore a meat dress to the MTV Awards. I don't know if that's a super American thing. One Direction was formed on X Factor. That happened kind of close to here. Instagram launched, and we have that to thank for a lot of really cringy photos. And I was in high school, super embarrassingly looking like a small child. And really one more major thing happened that year, and hopefully you can guess what that is, and that thing was AngularJS. And AngularJS, the predecessor of Angular as we know it today, really was the first framework to put all of these ideas of declarative model-driven UIs on the web. Template and UI logic was separate, but really it revolutionized the idea of what you could build on the web beyond just HTML and JavaScript injected a little bit and CSS for styling. And that lasted for a few years, and we got to 2013, and I very cringily went to prom and graduated high school, and something else came along that was heavily inspired by AngularJS. React followed with really digging into the MVC approach that AngularJS invented, and focused deeply on that view layer and introduced the idea of components. And a few years later, I went to Europe for the first time, and Angular came along. And this is modern Angular as we know it today, but in a very sort of elementary form. And it, again, evolved and sort of iterated on the ideas that React had taken from AngularJS. It obviously was heavily influenced by AngularJS. And it introduced the idea of component decorators, but it also introduced so many of the concepts of what we have today. And since then, React and other frameworks have continued to evolve, but it all started from that core space where every few years you saw these sort of major landmark moments happen on the web. And we were all there and a part of it in whatever way, whether you were just learning to code for the first time and sort of coming into this journey, and it felt like things were slowly moving towards a natural progression, and nobody really knew where they were headed. And for a few years, Angular sort of continued on this path, right? In these early days, you saw the bones introduced of things that we take for granted today on the web. Things like component developer kits or CDKs. That was revolutionary at the time. The Angular CLI launched as just a casual sort of thing the team wanted to bring because we needed a way for developers to be able to do things on the console. That was revolutionary, right? No framework had really done that or paired their releases with a CLI so tightly coupled. And to this day, that's how most of us build with Angular, right? And these are things today we're just sort of well, of course we have a CLI. Well, at the time, those were major advancements. And again, every few years, we were coming up with these things, schematics, right? Schematics were just sort of a part of these like early versions of Angular releases. And so the team had all of these really great ideas, and were doing truly revolutionary things. And while the team was doing these revolutionary sort of like, I don't even know how they came up with ideas, they were also accruing a ton of technical debt. And I think we can all relate to that, right? Like, for every good line of code we write, we read a lot of code that we like deeply regret having ever written. And specifically, that thing that Angular accrued that they felt like was really the technical debt holding them back was something called View Engine, which we don't need to talk deeply about, but we can just think of as sort of like the rendering engine that allows Angular to compile things and give browsers a set of instructions for how to show Angular apps to users. And so that set of instructions and the way that we were doing that rendering, we felt we could have done better. And every time we came up with these new ideas of sort of landmark features we wanted to bring to the web, we felt like there was maybe something holding us back from doing it in the most optimal way. And so the team came up with a plan that was super complex, that was really hard to communicate to the public, about how we were going to swap out the underneath rendering engine to something new that you may have heard of called Ivy. And if you haven't, forget I ever said it. All while like continuing to deliver these things. And so that was announced. And again, like in this period of time, you see that these years start to sort of slow. And that's because under the hood, the Angular team was really sort of in this like hibernation mode where we wanted to make sure that we were set up for the future. And so that brings us to 2020, where you maybe haven't seen these landmark features for a while, and that's because the team was really hunkering down working on these things. And in 2020, the team was finally ready to do revolutionary things again, and they made the best decision that they've ever made, and that was clearly hiring me. Thank you. No, obviously it was actually delivering Ivy. And so we finally had this new rendering engine, and it seemed like it was long awaited. It seemed like sort of these like major moments of Angular pushing the web forward had sort of stalled out. But the team had really just spent a lot of time getting this right. And externally, the web community had moved to being eager for new things, for all of that innovation that had sort of like jumbled between frameworks. And not everybody felt this way, right? The other thing the team was doing was really working on Angular at Google. And so in this time, as we were working on rendering engines and these things under the hood, we were also working on Google and how Google uses Angular. And Google had run on Angular, but in this time, it had completely shifted to relying on Angular. So in those years, it changed from just like Google was writing Angular code to like, in order to file a bug at Google, you do that on an Angular app. In order to look up code at Google, you do that on an Angular app. In order to write or edit any code at Google, you do that in Angular. In order to open a PR, or we call it CL, but you do that on an Angular app. So not only were we like shipping Angular code out into the wild, but like even the Google Maps app on your Android device that should have nothing to do with Angular relies on Angular to make it happen. And so we really felt like we had a great user base and a great reason to continue improving this framework. We just wanted to push that out into the public again. And you may see some of those as like Google Cloud, Firebase, Google Analytics, but there's so much more under the hood that's really using it. And so in this time, the team had really been thinking and brainstorming of what we could do, right? We were writing all this code about rendering engines, and we were thinking about like schematics and the CLI and the framework and what the framework meant. And we entered sort of what I'd like to call a chaos period, where After 2020, this thing sort of shifted where we could suddenly do all of the things that we'd sort of like left for post-Ivy or left for sort of a time when we had finally gotten all of our code into a good, healthy place. And you saw like literally so many features come out at once. Those versions of like 15, 16, 12 forward, versions 12 to 16, let's say. It was sort of this chaos period where like I joined the team and I literally couldn't keep up with every minor version, every patch release, every major version. We would sit down and try and write the blog post and like be cutting out features because we literally couldn't keep up with how many different things the team was pushing out to the world. And they seemed small for like many people, but changed other apps' entire structures, right? Inline SaaS meant that like people who had wanted to do single file components but couldn't because they relied on SaaS structures could suddenly do single file components, which could lead to like these sort of like chains of like optimizations that changed a lot of developers' apps for the better. And each one of these features like really deserves its own talk, but this period was really great. And it wasn't just features. It was also things like a new developer tools that allowed you to debug your Angular application specifically in the browser, new partnerships with Chrome on how you could debug, an entire like month dedicated to the backlog where we could look through the backlog and close thousands of issues. You saw the issues in the Google Angular repository go from like 3,000 to 1,000 overnight because the team was just looking through all of them and realizing we had done a lot of that work and we could finally like start telling the community about all the cool things we'd done. And there's no denying that in those years we did a ton of work, but it was really hard to keep up with. And even though we felt like we were in a healthy place, we had been brainstorming about something larger. All of these changes sort of like individually made a big impact on you as developers, and we saw that and we felt that, and we were so excited to be delivering that work. But we wanted to deliver a more focused approach. We wanted to come to the community with an idea of like, what is Angular and where is it headed? We're not just like delivering features because you're asking for them. We really have a vision of how to be revolutionary and push the web forward. And so you started to see us define that as a more focused approach, where Angular's goal truly has always been to deliver web apps with confidence. It's been positioned to focus on three things: default performance, that is performance that is baked into how Angular at its core runs; developer experience; and stability and reliability, right? Schematics, the CLI, NG update, NG upgrade, all of these things that come with a developer-focused framework that is meant for enterprises, that's used by the Googles of the world, but can also be used by small apps and developers and startups that want to become the next Google of the world. And all of these things sort of are an evolution of this term that when I joined the team, I think it was a really loaded term to call Angular opinionated. I think we really tried to steer away from that for a long time, and I always asked, like, why? And I think there was a lot of community distrust in this idea of opinionated, right? Other frameworks, other languages had sort of like ideated on the idea that being unopinionated was a good thing because it allowed you freedom. But what I think opinionated means isn't like being restrictive. It doesn't mean that you like can't do things with Angular because it's opinionated. What it means is when you set out to do things, Angular is opinionated about how to help you do them in the best way possible, about what the best thing is, right? Like opinionated about what good is on the web. It means we're opinionated about what a good developer experience is. So coming into an app and having a familiar style of what that app should look like. It means being opinionated about performance fine-tunings and best practices so that if you have a new developer on your team, they don't have to think about, like, how do I do this in the best way possible? The framework is already sort of guiding them to an opinionated best practice of how to do things in a performant way. And it means being opinionated about how we release things, right? It's sometimes unpopular, but Angular releases 2 versions a year in a very stable structure so that we can rely, and our enterprise partners can rely on us to be there for them every 6 months with a small set of new features so that you can iteratively get all of these baked-in performance gains and best practices and not wait for us to suddenly announce like a new release coming. And so I think we, in this period, took that word opinionated and turned it into something that could be opinionated for good. And the other thing we started to think about is how we do these things, right? We had been pushing features, we'd been working on GitHub, we'd never really disappeared from the public, but we wanted to be more regimented about how we delivered things so that you as a community could expect communication and expect how to see the Angular team working. And one of the first things we did was introduce requests for comments. So in this sort of post-chaos period of 2022 to now, you've seen the team publish tens of requests for comments and really focus on engaging with open source in ways that benefit both open source and the Angular team. So Angular has always been open source, but it's really hard to develop like a hundreds of thousands of line framework that's used by all of these different partners and have people be able to submit PRs. And sometimes the best way to engage in open source isn't to make sure that we have thousands of contributors always fixing Angular bugs, but that you can open bugs and expect communication back from our team. And most importantly, we thought that requests for comments were the best way to engage with open source. So we began literally open sourcing our major design documents. So these are things that every feature at Google has tens of pages of something we call a product review design or PRD. And we're literally open sourcing those. We're giving those to you as the public and expecting feedback, right? We've done this with things like signals. We've done this with things like control flow. And we get meaningful feedback from the community, right? There's value on both sides. You can literally read why we're doing something, what we're going to do, and how we plan to do it. But then we can also expect that the community can say, hey, I hate that. And we'll respond. We legitimately want that feedback. With control flow, it means we changed the syntax of what that syntax would be. With signals, we've rethought a lot of the primitives of how those signals work because of feedback from community apps. So these things have really benefited both the Angular team and the community. You saw us also think about how we communicate the work after it's built, right? This was the sort of renaissance of all of our social media, where we realized with all of those new features in every version, it's hard to keep up with. And so we wanted to make sure we were delivering blog posts and videos and opinionated best practices so that you could slowly iterate and fix your apps or introduce these new features to your apps so that there's not just a million new features at all times. And you also started to see us engage more with the community and come to conferences and speak with people. We have a team of amazing people, and we are always welcome, and so thankful for all of you. And please, always feel free to come up and talk to us. We're really not that scary. And hopefully you felt like you started to see the team really dig into these community values and start doing things that aligned with these goals. So with this aligned vision, with these aligned ways of how we're going to drive this change, the team started doing stuff. You saw this with standalone, which is about to be the default experience for Angular apps in literally a month, and made major improvements to developer experience, but also performance. You saw things like Angular signals target how we could build performance into the framework in ways that reduce some of the pitfalls we were seeing people have, but also have significant improvements for things like INP in your core web vitals. You saw things like control flow improve performance by default, but also iterate on what it means to template your apps, bringing 90% faster runtime for built-in control flow loops, but also literally just be easier to write code and easier to read. You saw things like local template variables with let come from the ability to write control flow. You saw deferrable views bring huge performance gains and sort of a revolutionary idea of how to lazy load and how to defer loading on the web. You saw 87% faster builds with hybrid rendering and 67% faster builds for client-side rendering. You've seen major introductions to things like hydration, where Angular has answered sort of like and been a part of framework's revolution towards hydration and loading on the web. And you saw all of this come from new documentation that represents this opinionated way to guide developers towards what we feel is modern Angular development. And you saw all of this with a new future-looking logo that reflects this modern Angular. And so that brings us to today. And the momentum that we've felt in the last couple years hopefully has sort of been captured by this like slow build to this, which is in a lot of ways the same vision that if you go back and read this blog post from years ago, we've always been headed in this direction. We've been headed in this way that's opinionated about developer experience, baked-in performance, and staying true to the stability that got us to where we are. And the change is that we feel like the community is now brought into this with us. And it's not just you in this room who, whether you like it or not, you're all part of the Angular community now. But it's the web community. It's developers as a whole. We started to see major publications take notice, and they coined it as something called the Angular Renaissance, probably related to the fact that Beyoncé was on the Renaissance tour. But I think Angular is just as cool as Beyoncé. You heard it here first. And this change really does represent this like major shift in how the world perceives Angular. But there's not that much that's different about Angular. We're iterating, we're improving, and we're like bringing incremental revolutionary ideas to the web. We're just doing it in a more public way. We're doing it in a more focused way, and we're doing it a lot faster because we've set ourselves up for success from all of this prior work. And the question really is, like, where do we go from here? Can the team continue every 6 months to, like, bring so many new features that it's hard to write a blog post about? And I think the answer is duh. We're already doing it. And you can already see hints of what's on the horizon in some of the things we've already shared. So you may have heard of this already, and if not, I think this is worth sharing because this is really where Angular's momentum is headed next. And that's the idea of collaboration and convergence. So you may not have heard of this, but Google actually has another web framework named Wiz. And believe it or not, Angular is the easy-to-write framework at Google. Wiz is not open source for a reason. It's tightly coupled to Google's internal tech stack. It's hyper-focused on performance above all other things, like developer experience. But it is revolutionary in how it hyper-focuses on that performance, how it brings streaming and hydration to the web. And it's used by Google's flagship consumer products, think like search and chat and Meet and Photos and Play and these things that are web apps that are not Angular. And that's because Angular is focused on highly interactive, like enterprise apps, and Wiz is focused on latency-sensitive, more consumer apps, things where you need to serve ads and results really quickly, right? If you Google search something and you don't have answers by the time you've finished thinking of your question, that's too late. The thing is, these types of apps are converging, right? You all are thinking about how to bring that fast search result to your users at the same time as thinking about how to load giant dashboards of data. And so inside of Google, but also externally, we've seen the needs of users converge, and we've really wanted to bring the best of Wiz to open source through Angular. And so that's our goal. And you may not know this, but we're already doing that. So YouTube, one of the largest user bases and apps at Google, is already using Angular signals primitives for 100% of YouTube web mobile traffic. And they've seen major improvements, like 35% improvement to interaction latency and 60% frame per section lower interaction latency. And so this collaboration isn't going anywhere. You've already seen the reverse of things happen, where we're open sourcing the best of Wiz, these things that are really revolutionary to web development at Google through Angular. Things like Event Replay, which is in developer preview now, is a part of that core interaction of what brings and makes Google search so special, like the secret sauce behind it, is literally open sourced through Angular and is now available as part of the Angular repository. And so this brings us to the future of like, we're doing these things, we're revolutionizing the web. And if you asked a Magic 8-Ball, like my prediction on what's going to happen next, I may be a little biased because I have internal knowledge, but I'd say a lot of it's just continuing the momentum, right? Like, I don't think the team really needs to do anything differently except continue with the path it's set out for themselves. This momentum is led by all of these things I've talked about, but it has this future vision, like, clearly defined, right? It's things I've talked about today, a simplified developer experience with new authoring formats, similar to control flow, but think iterating on sort of those patterns. It means going all in on signals, right? Bringing all of those out of developer preview, but also things like signal-based components, signal-based apps, things like that. It means working with Wiz and all of the frameworks at Google to bring Wiz into Angular and open source it to the world. And through that, things like hydration and streaming explorations, SSR, all of these things that we have answers to from other pieces and other places in the web community, but we feel Angular could be the first to bring to the web, or the first major framework to really introduce these things to your web apps that you already have built. And the thing that's really crazy about all of this is we're going to continue to do it in the same way we have been, right? Leveraging open source, opening or like publishing requests for comments of all of those design docs of the literal implementation of how we plan to do it, publishing guides on angular.dev of how you can actually implement those things, tutorials, recommendations, engaging with communities here and online as we sort of iterate. And so I hope you feel like Angular's momentum is set up for success. I hope you feel excited, or just as excited as I do, about the horizon of innovation in this next period of everything Angular has planned. And we're so excited to help you build great web apps. So with all of that, I hope as you look at the talks for the rest of today and tomorrow, you pick one feature, one new thing, because the talks in the next 2 days, I looked at the program this morning, really span like all of these things I've talked about, signals and hydration and how to build AI into your Angular apps and all of these things that are part of this momentum that's been building. And bring those back to your teams, bring those back to your personal development, join our momentum, and really feel good about the fact that the path that you've joined will really bring you to the web's future. So thank you so much.